not yet entered. Now, Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." 30 years ago, when I was a news photographer in a small town in Western Pennsylvania, I put some time into a photographic project about the lives of Black people in a northern small town. So for about a year, more or less, I found myself occasionally present at family reunions or church functions, which were sometimes, as happens here, the same thing. And I became familiar with a common practice at gatherings of Black families or Black churches. Before the meal, before the prayer over the meal, everyone gathers around in a circle and says their favorite Bible verse. And in these settings, a person to my right or my left, usually a stranger to me, would lean over and, assuming that because I was a white person, I did not have a Bible verse memorized, they would very kindly whisper to me a verse that I could use. With some frequency, it was the verse "Jesus wept," which has the reputation as the shortest verse in the Bible. That same verse came up with some frequency in the responses of small children, or sometimes those who had fallen away from the church. But some verse, whether this short one or another one, was always told to me with such kindness that even when I learned to be prepared for this ritual, and I took it upon myself to memorize a verse so I would be prepared, if someone leaned over to me and gave me a verse to say, I used the verse that they had offered to me. And I believe that it was in large part my willingness to acknowledge my weakness and gladly accept these gifts from strangers that allowed me to make connections and move within a community in which I was fundamentally and always a stranger. We began our time of worship with a passage from the preacher and theologian Howard Thurman, in which Thurman alludes to how difficult it is for us to be vulnerable, to allow ourselves to be seen when we are overwhelmed or damaged, outsmarted or paralyzed, or simply in physical or emotional pain so great it diminishes our ability to think. Our first defensive mechanisms to being in that position of diminishment is to deny that we are, to make light of our pain, to make light of our confusion, to make light of not knowing what to do by pretending that none of those things are happening. We deny these things because they point to our human vulnerability. When we acknowledge them, we seem weak to ourselves, unable to meet the responsibilities of personhood and our responsibilities to those for whom we care. We would rather give to God, and probably even to those closest to us, a less than complete version of ourselves than to include within the picture the part of us that stands quivering and unknowing, pained and panic-stricken. And yet Jesus came to earth and presented us with the reality of a vulnerable God. That is, a God open to the influence of the surrounding world. A naked and defenseless baby in a cradle, a man who shouted at the devil, a man who mourned for his friends, a man who would ultimately cry out in pain from the cross. Jesus wept. Weeping is the sign of vulnerability. Weeping is the result of being open to and affected by what the world brings to you. In the passage from John, which supplies this oft quoted verse, Jesus has traveled to his friends Mary, Martha, and Lazarus in Bethesda. Mary and Martha have sent for Jesus because Lazarus has become sick. But by the time Jesus arrives, Lazarus has died and been in the tomb for 4 days. Eventually, Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, but on the way to that moment, he mourns with his friends Mary and Martha, and he experiences his own grief in response to the death of his friend. He is in one of those moments that Howard Thurman describes as upheaval of mind with all of the inward torture with which the skill of man finds no way to deal. What's interesting about the reflexive defense we have against sharing our vulnerability with others, even with God, is that it turns out that scientifically, vulnerability, or at least one aspect of it, is crucial to relationships. And that aspect is the willingness to be open to influence. The psychologist John Gottman, who has been researching how marriages work for 40 years and runs something called the Marriage Lab at the University of Washington in Seattle, has identified being open to influence as one of the 7 principles of a successful relationship. The willingness to let your partner influence you on things like where you go to dinner, or what color you paint the living room, or how you're going to handle your finances. The willingness to hear and respond to what your partner says. And he's talking about marriages, but I believe this is true of friendships or any other kind of relationship. Relationships work because we are willing to be open to influence. And it's easy to look at our lives and say that we are open to influence, that we go have dinner where our friend wants to go have dinner. But I think it's actually less easy to truly be open to influence, something that I think occurs time and again in something like monthly meeting for business. And I think the true test, a true test, not the only test, but one, I think, very telling test of whether a person is open to influence, whether I am open to influence, or whether you are open to influence, is to ask yourself how easy you find it to accept gifts from others. Birthday presents, or hospitality, or the gift of time. Accepting someone's gift with gladness and grace is a sure sign of how open to influence you are. And I know this because of several crucial people in my life who found it impossible to accept gifts from other people unless they told them specifically what to give them. If you are going to give me a gift for my birthday, this is what it needs to be. With any other gift, I will not be satisfied. There is a sign of failing to be open to influence. So if you want to really know whether you yourself are a person open to influence, ask yourself how well you receive gifts. I was thinking about this yesterday, listening to Neil Snar's memorial service, which I attended over Zoom. Neil Snar, in his time as a father and a grandfather and a professor at Wilmington College, influenced many, many people. All of his grandchildren spoke about his influence. Former students spoke about his influence. Faculty members spoke about his influence. And many of these people talked about Neil's ability to seemingly turn up out of nowhere, what they called jumping out from behind a bush and propose to you something that you had never thought of for yourself. And then they would go out to lunch with him and he would talk about, well, why don't you visit Africa? Or why don't you take this trip with the Isaac Harvey Fund? Why don't you go to Costa Rica? Why don't you come to Washington, D.C. on the spring lobby trip to Friends Committee on National Legislation? And the people who were open to that influence found their lives changed. My story with Neil was somewhat different. He did not necessarily come and jump out at a bush at me when I was campus minister at Wilmington College. What he did was come and knock on my office door. And you have to perhaps know that when you are the campus minister at Wilmington College, pretty much everyone who comes to talk to you from the yearly meeting has some idea what you should be doing in your job. And largely what those ideas amount to is, can't you gather up a group of college students to come and work on my project? Can't you corral some college students somehow, throw a lasso around them and drag them off to Martinsville to reinvigorate the meeting there? Can't you drag them here or drag them there to do this really good Quaker work that needs some younger bodies to be done? That's what a lot of people approach you with when you are the campus minister at Wilmington College. And Neil certainly knocked on my door and suggested that I lasso students and do this and do that. But often he knocked on my door to say that I really should have a bulletin board outside my office so that I could paste more posters and notices about Quaker projects, so that I could put up stuff about the American Friends Committee and put up stuff that the Friends Committee on National Legislation was doing, and put up this and put up that, and really proselytize about Quaker political activity to all of the students at Wilmington College, 99% of whom were not Quaker, and 75% of whom did not stay on campus on the weekends, or 80% or 85%. And at the same time that Neil would tell me how much I needed a bulletin board, my boss was a person who had said at the time, and my first year there was the year that Barack Obama was running for president. She had said that students who came to her and wanted to hold a political rally for Barack Obama could not do so because it might lead to political contention, because there wasn't a similar rally being held for John McCain. And the reason that there wasn't a rally that would be held for John McCain was because no students had come to her and said that they wanted to have a rally for McCain. But as far as she was concerned, that didn't matter. There could be no Obama rally if there weren't also a McCain rally. And since there was no McCain rally forthcoming, we could not have any kind of political rally because that would cause dissension. So Neil wanted me to put up posters on my bulletin board talking about immigration issues, issues at the border, issues in Asia, issues with work and hunger. And my boss was saying we cannot have any discussions that might cause ill feelings between students. There was a bulletin board down the hall, and I used that bulletin board. I felt I did not need a bulletin board right outside my office. And so Neil would come knock on my door and say, you really need a bulletin board there. And I'd say, Neil, I don't know how I would get a bulletin board. I don't think the physical plant will honor my request for a bulletin board. I think I'm fine. I don't really need a bulletin board. I have other means of getting the news out. And one day I heard a noise outside my office and opened the door, and there was Neil with a bulletin board. And in about 10 minutes, he put a bulletin board up outside my office. He had friends in the physical plant. He knew where the bulletin boards were kept. He went, he got a bulletin board. He brought his drill over. He hung the bulletin board up outside my office. He didn't ask anyone for permission to do this. He didn't go through the physical plant. He simply hung a bulletin board up outside my office. And there was this bulletin board, and I started to post things on it. Not from the AFSC or Friends Committee on National Legislation, but I did post things from Friends World Conference on Consultation, which is not so politically divisive. And I posted things from, say, Catholics as well. And now there was a bulletin board outside my office, which I used occasionally. On the one hand, I absolutely admired his energy and his dedication and his thoughtfulness in getting something done. On the other hand, as campus minister, I pretty clearly rejected Neil's frequent attempts to have influence over me. And I understand why. It was because in an environment where everyone was trying to tell me what to do, I had to figure out some way to have my own discernment about what I was capable of doing, what I felt called to do, and what I felt college students might respond to, which wasn't simply using them to be spare bodies for somebody else. We all have reasons for rejecting the influence of others. We have the way we were raised as children. We have whatever dysfunctions and difficulties our parents and grandparents and family systems had that they weighted us down with. We have the examples of people who never listened to us, but always told us what to do, people with the authority to enforce us doing things. We have the experience of having our own sense of self, of who we are, our sense of our autonomy, our ability to make decisions about what to do with our life. Having had these things attacked and assaulted by grown-ups in our lives, by friends, people who say they're friends at any rate, by mentors, we hang on to ourselves and our ideas, and sometimes we do this at the expense of damaging our relationships. And yet there were 30 people at Neil's memorial yesterday who had sat down with Neil and allowed him to influence their lives and had found that their lives grew larger and their relationship with God grew deeper because Neil had influenced them. When we give up on being open to the influence of others, we give up on the possibility of discovering a larger God. Jesus wept. God wept because God, in the person of Jesus, experienced more of the world in being influenced by his friends. And so to follow that example, I believe that now for us, one of the easiest ways to allow God to take up a greater proportion of our lives is to become more open to truly hearing and responding to others, to laugh when they are laughing, to weep when they grieve, to listen to their ideas about where to go and what to do, to be open to their influence. And because this openness, because this vulnerability is something that we have been taught, something that we have learned from experience to protect ourselves against, perhaps the best way to achieve this openness is to pray for it. Our creating and loving God Diminish our defenses in those areas of life where they are not needed. Give us the confidence that what someone says to us cannot harm us, because our identity does not rest in them, but in you. Allow us to hear those whose words pain us, either because their own pain is so great or because their intention is to wound us with words. Allow us to pass on to you those pains that we cannot hold in ourselves, to give to another the gift of listening to their pain, to hold it, to pass it on to you. Allow us to truly love others to the degree that they can shape and form us, that they can alter our plans, that they can take up our time. Give us the capacity to love those with whom we differ and those whom we do not understand, which would very probably be all human beings, including ourselves. We ask these things through Christ, whose always loving heart makes them possible.